As a church leader, would you agree with me that one of the most frustrating things is when you host a volunteer training event and like only half the volunteers show up or a third of the volunteers, like you're missing so many people? That is hard. That's always a challenge. I remember when our leadership team from my church went to another church for kind of like a mini conference. It was about 100 leaders from other churches. It was all about going multi-site. And this was one of the church leaders in multi-site churches. And so there's only about 100 leaders in this room. And the pastor of that church that was hosting it was talking about how back then, this was like 15 years ago, their church would do monthly volunteer trainings on Saturday morning for like 3 hours. All ministries were invited. Every ministry did the kind of their own thing, which was a lot, obviously. I don't think they're doing that today. I don't know if that would fly today. But that's what they did. That was their model. And that pastor, as he was talking through it, just kind of off the cuff said, "Hey, what percentage of people show up on average to your volunteer trainings?" And people are answering from the crowd, 50%, 60%, 40%, whatever. And one of our staff raised his hand and said 80%. And I was like, whoa, that sounds high. You know what I mean? Like all the other answers are 40, 50, 60. And I remember thinking, there's no way that's true. And I thought, you know what? That is true. Because at the time, one of the areas he was responsible for was worship arts. And our church was only a couple years old. It was a plant. A lot of the people that were in the worship arts ministry, in fact, many of them had come from another church that helped start our church. So there was just really high buy in there. Plus, the commitment level on that team was pretty high. I mean, there weren't low. I don't want to. I hesitate to say this, so don't kill me in the comments. But there are some roles in churches that are just lower commitment, right? I mean, if that's an every other week role, that is less commitment than a weekly role. If it's a role that doesn't require coming out midweek to rehearse with the band, right? There's less time commitment there. It doesn't mean it's less important or less needed. We need all of that in our church. So anyway, he had a team of highly committed roles and highly committed people. So no wonder they were getting 80%. I would say at the time, our children's ministry probably got like 60 some percent. Same for student ministry was probably a little slightly higher. Our guest services is probably lower though. It's probably 50, 40% because again, I believe there's a strong correlation between the commitment of the role and how often people show up for those kinds of things. But my point is, even back then, 15 years ago, people were not getting great attendance at their volunteer trainings. And I don't know about you, but I would say it's probably worse now. In fact, leave a comment. Let me know, is volunteer training attendance better or worse now for your ministry? And if so, tell me why that is. See, big trainings that I hear from most church leaders I talk with, those big training gatherings typically have low attendance. 30 to 50% of your volunteers on average show up to those. And even worse, the volunteers who need it the most are the ones who don't show up. Doesn't that happen all the time? Like you're going to do a training on this topic and oh, here comes all your best volunteers. They don't even need to know it. In fact, they could teach it. And where are the people we need, right? Like those are the ones who don't show up. So you can have better attendance, but I want to set a couple realistic expectations. One, I don't think 100% is realistic. That's not church attendance. That's hardly anything. 80% is probably the high end of realistic. But if you can get in that 60 to 80% window, I think you're doing pretty well. Now, again, there's a correlation depending on what ministry you lead and what the commitment of the roles already is. So, but 60 to 80% is pretty good, but it's not 100%. So you're still going to want to supplement this idea with some of the other ideas I've talked about in videos about training strategy. So check the playlist for other videos about creating a year-long training strategy for your volunteers, because you'll need that, because even good attendance isn't going to be enough to train volunteers the way you want. So let's talk about the 4 keys to boost attendance at trainings. 1, use personal invites. And so what I mean is use a system for RSVPs and communicate it for anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. So what I like to do is, email everybody 8 weeks out, save the date, maybe 6 weeks out, starting 6 weeks out, I'm emailing every week to the people who didn't attend. So like, don't keep emailing that, the people that already RSVP'd 3 weeks ago. That's, nobody wants to hear that. That's like annoying, right? So emphasize that everyone should RSVP, even if it's a no, because you need to know so you don't keep emailing them. But email them weekly. That's why I say use a system so that you know who has not RSVP'd and you can email only them and not, annoy everybody by emailing everyone all the time. You can use like Evites or different websites that do that. I'm sure there's apps that you can do that. Sometimes in the past, we've just used our church management system and a form. And once you fill out the form, we just always search to see who has filled out the form and who hasn't, and so we're only emailing the people that haven't filled out the form. Once you're getting closer to the gathering, text about it. Send a text 2 to 3 weeks out. Again, you're just texting those who haven't RSVP'd. At this point, I do like to remind even the people that RSVP'd, hey, looking forward to seeing you at the training. Just a reminder, it's this time, this date, that whole thing. But the people that haven't RSVP'd, text them about 2 to 3 weeks out, and then talk about it in person about 1 to 2 weeks out. So if you're 2 weeks out from the event, the training gathering, and you still have some volunteers who haven't RSVP'd, you should have a list so that when, if you're ministry, kids ministry, and you're serving on Sunday, I'm looking for Dan, I'm looking for Joe, I'm looking for Katie, you know what I mean? Like, absolutely. And if you have a big team, get other people to help you with that. Like, do you have some volunteers that can ask the other volunteers if they're coming, and get an RSVP right there if you can. And then eventually, if you've gotten to 2 weeks out, like less than 2 weeks out, like a week out, and there's still some people you don't know, again, personal text, personal calls, all those things. Mention it in all of your other communication as well. Obviously, I mean, if you send a weekly email about curriculum, just mention it in there. If you have weekly volunteer huddles, which we talk about in one of the other videos, again, you're going to mention it there. So you just want to talk about it consistently leading up to it. Second key, make them easy to attend. Provide childcare, paid or volunteer. I know that's hard sometimes because maybe you don't have the budget for that. I would push hard to get budget for that. Pay some teenagers to provide childcare for volunteers that need it. They can put that in the RSVP so you know how many you're talking about. If not, maybe if you're only doing this once or twice a year, you could probably ask around for volunteers to provide childcare for that training. Feed them. Again, this is one of those ones. It's like, it's tough because you don't want to spend a lot of money here, and that can get expensive real quick. But ideally, feed them somehow. We've done potlucks before. I grew up in church where we did potlucks every week. But we have done in our history, I know we've had volunteer trainings where it was kind of like a potluck thing. Hey, who can bring what? Sign up for stuff. And maybe we, the church itself, we would pay for certain things and drinks and whatever, but then people would bring food and we would do it that way. So it doesn't have to be extravagant, but feed them. Pick the date strategically. So if you're going to help them attend, if you're going to have food, you're going to provide childcare, you also want to pick the date strategically to make it easy for people to attend. So avoid big things that impact many people. So, don't pick the first 2 weeks that school start, because a lot of parents of kids will have back to school nights. Don't pick holiday weekends where people are going to be out of town. There's always going to be people that miss, always, but you're trying to avoid those big things. Also pick the date strategically in terms of your own church calendar. Don't, have a huge event where you're huge training where you're, calling all these volunteers to come out. And then a week later is a big family thing where 60% of those same volunteers are supposed to come again, which is tough. I know a lot of churches do too many things and the calendar's too full, but do your best to pick a date strategically so that they can attend, make it easy for them. Meet at a convenient time. Can you meet when they're already there? I mean, lunch after Sunday for our kids ministry and our student ministry volunteers. Actually, adult small groups will do breakfast on Sunday morning. Our guest services teams will do this as well. So that has proven to be one of the most convenient times. Midweek at night is another time. It's not great because people usually have something, but generally it's, probably the second best choice, I think. We have done like a Friday night. That's not great unless you make it a big thing. And we have done that, and that has been highly successful. But usually that's where we're inviting spouses, and it's a big night in general. It feels like a night out, not just a training. So you got to figure out how to do that, what's going to work. Ideally, you just want to make it convenient and mix it up. If you do 2 a year, you probably want to do 2 different days to try to give that a shot. I know one of the things I will encourage, and I'm sure different staff would disagree, but like if you're doing a Wednesday night, for example, or whatever, a Tuesday night, if you have small groups in your church, a lot of your volunteers may have a small group that meets that night. And I would specifically tell them, skip the group, come to the training. You know what I mean? Like, your group's going to meet however many times a year. We're only going to do this once or twice. Skip the group, come to the training. All right. Number 3, key to boost volunteer attendance of volunteer trainings. You have to create a can't miss culture. So encourage and support them. Who doesn't love that? I mean, if you do that at your volunteer trainings and people come experience it, they're going to want to come back. They're not going to want to miss. You got to have fun. I mean, who doesn't want to have fun? Like, if you're not the kind of person that can come up with, ways to have fun and, different ideas and games, Get help planning it if needed, but you got to have fun. Here's the caveat though. Think about your introverts that don't want to be embarrassed. So fun, if you want to have extroverts up that don't care and they get embarrassed, great. But make sure it's a volunteer thing. Don't force any volunteers into something that is awkward. Even if, I mean, this applies even to things that aren't fun. If you force volunteers into things that are awkward that they didn't want to do or weren't prepared for, they're not going to come back. So that it's a balance. You got to have fun, but in a way that everybody can enjoy that and not be stressed out by it. Share important information. I mean, part of what makes a can't miss culture is sharing something that if you don't come, you're going to miss it. Like that's what's going to happen. And this is one of those things like, hey, got to volunteer. We got a training gathering. It's happening this date. I've got some important news to share. And maybe it's, I don't know, you get a new series you're launching, new curriculum. Don't oversell it because then eventually, people will just know that, it's not really that important. So this only works if you actually do have something important to share, but don't tell them in advance. Hey, what is it? You got to come to find out. You know what I mean? You got to come to find out and just stick to that. Now, after, sure, you can tell people over email or whatever, but make them come there to hear it first. Foster connection. Connected people come more often. So your people that are, if you want to have a can't miss feel, you want to create a connection there for them among other volunteers and other leaders, because ultimately that's what's going to help them stick as volunteers and in coming to those gatherings. They're going to want to come hang out with the people that they know and then they're connected to. So foster that connection. And last, and this is probably the one that is the most important, I think, to get that, good attendance, you need follow-up accountability. And specifically, it's one piece of this that's the most important. But let me talk through all of it. You want to follow up with each group of people differently. So think of the people that volunteer and they're supposed to come to this gathering. They're in 4 different groups. One of them is people that RSVP'd yes, and they attended. That's an easy follow-up. Send a thank you and a recap. Another one is the group that RSVP'd no. So they told you in advance they couldn't come, which is unfortunate, but that's life. Send them a, hey, we missed you. Here's what happened. Here's what you missed. And then there's 2 categories. This is the important part. This is where you got to follow up differently. People that RSVP'd yes, but then didn't show. It's like find some way to track attendance. You're emailing them asking, hey, missed you at the training. Is everything okay? And then, and this is the one that usually keeps a lot of attendance down, people that didn't RSVP at all. Like you did all that stuff. You emailed weekly, you texted, you tried to find them in person. And there's always, usually, now I shouldn't say always, but usually there are people who don't RSVP. And so you reach out and the email, and my email would literally say, hey, Katie, we missed you at the volunteer gathering last week. Is everything okay? ? Send. You know what I mean? Like that's literally the email. So that turns the heat up. That accountability is like right here now. Now, once they write back, I turn the heat down. Like they could literally write back and be like, oh, I'm sorry. I don't want to miss the end of the series on TV. That was the finale. Okay. Hey, would love to have you at volunteer trainings in the future. Here's what you missed. So the heat can get turned down once they reply. But what you're communicating is this matters. You matter. You being at this matters. And I noticed. And because people can kind of self-select out like, that's not for me. That's for like people that just do this or do that or whatever. So accountability here will determine future attendance or not. So create a template planning sheet or download ours. Just go to ministryboost.org/training sheet. We've got a planning sheet there that you can use to kind of plan and launch your volunteer training event. Download that there and then watch the next video on creating a year-long strategy for training your volunteers. I'll put a link to that training sheet in the description below if you want to check that out there. And if you want to get other resources to help you with leading, recruiting, training volunteers, head to ministryboost.org where we have courses, resources, and a membership where you can get all of it for one low monthly cost. All right, now use this, get your own, make your own sheet, download our sheet at ministryboost.org/training sheet and put together your plan for your next big volunteer training.